professor. I made dear friends who are still friends to this day. While I was at SIU, it was very transformative period of my life.
Mm-hmm. Well, good. Let's go on from a little bit more about your career. When you started, when you were ordained as a minister, what did you kind of see yourself doing, or what direction did you initially?
Excuse me. Sorry, got a frog. I was trained in seminary to be a parish priest, which I did for 5 years. Mm-hmm. But it became very clear to me that the portion of that ministry that I liked the most was pastoral care, calling on the sick and those who were having personal issues and so on and so forth. So I went back to, I didn't go back, but I went to Presbyterian St. Luke's Hospital in Chicago, where I was ministering, and did my training in what was called clinical pastoral training, which intensified, focused on pastoral ministry and hospital chaplaincy work. So that really, that was 3.5 years. And that really set me up when the AIDS epidemic started in the early 80s. By that time, I was back in a parish setting in Washington, D.C. And when my friends began to die of AIDS, which was horrifying to me, it took me 3 years to struggle with that. But that's when I decided to start the AIDS ministry in the Diocese of Washington, D.C. And I plunged full time into AIDS chaplaincy work. And I think if I hadn't had that hospital chaplaincy training in the 70s, I could never have sustained doing AIDS ministry full time, which I did until 2001.
Okay. Well, tell me about that kind of the first time you heard about the HIV virus and the AIDS and AIDS itself. What year was that, and where were you at?
Well, in 82, I read a little article in Time magazine. It was 3 paragraphs long about gay men dying in Los Angeles and New York with a strange pneumonia that was only seen in very, very sick old people in intensive care units. And I thought, well, that's very strange. And really didn't give it much more thought until the next year in 83. I came to California to a big family reunion, the Anderson family, and then I went into San Francisco to visit some friends, one of whom actually had been the rector of the Episcopal Church in Carbondale, who had baptized me in the Episcopal Church. And I was shocked because they were depressed and telling me about friends who were dying of this strange illness. And I just couldn't believe it. So I went back to Washington with this very much on my mind. And I tried to tell friends what I'd heard in San Francisco, and nobody wanted to listen. And then within 6 weeks or so, a dear friend, 32-year-old man, died. He was hospitalized with AIDS and was very close to death when I went to see him. And that was a horrifying experience. He had lost his mind. He had probably toxoplasmosis, which was a virus that affected the brain. He was totally out of his mind. His family were absolutely hysterical. And I could not believe it. But that was the first. And then other friends began to die, I was called on to minister to people who I didn't know. And by 86, I realized that I could, in fact, work full time with people with AIDS. And that's when we started the Episcopal Caring Response to AIDS, a non-for-profit in Washington, D.C. And that just, then I was really up and running then.
And what kind of things did that ministry kind of involve? What were the day-to-day activities of it? And what were some of the larger initiatives taken?
Well, the daily activities were going to see people in the hospital. I started a weekly healing service for people with AIDS. We did, then I also got politically in the AIDS movement, got caught up in, a lobbying for change and policy change and so on and so forth. I was reminded now that Tony Fauci is back in the news, he had just started at NIH in '84. And the first interfaith AIDS conference that we put together was in early '87, and he was on our panel. I was on the panel with him. Mm-hmm. And of course, we became very strong supporters of him because he was an incredible spokesman. And as policies began to change, he was at the forefront of that. So to see him back in the news in regards to this epidemic is, for me, very reassuring. But I also went out and spoke. I became a spokesman, advocating policy change and compassion for people with AIDS, and I was wearing several hats.
Okay. I think while they're different in very fundamental ways, there's a lot of similarities in terms of somewhat of the way that the AIDS virus and the current COVID-19 virus are similar. AIDS itself was another what they call zoonotic virus that believed to have jumped from a chimpanzee to a human at some point in the not too distant past, but by the late 70s, early 80s was starting to show up in various pockets, affecting people around into various places around the world. And there was a lot of misunderstanding about it early on. And can you speak to that a little bit about, from your perspective, you were seeing people dying of something in strange ways, of things they shouldn't be dying from, and you really don't know what's happening with it. At the same time, on a larger level, there was so much misconception about what this virus was at the onset.
Yes, in that regards, the great similarities. What struck me at the beginning of this, when we were closing down, was I thought, dear God, we went through one epidemic, do we have to go through another? And the fear around the AIDS virus and people getting sick was immense. As it is now, of course, the difference is now this is a much more easily caught virus.
Right.
It's born, and it's universal. I mean, well, AIDS became universal, but in the beginning, it wasn't seen as a universal threat. And of course, it was in the beginning was primarily gay men, which were already stigmatized and ostracized. So that made it more complicated in trying to get attention. But one of the things that heartens me about what's going on now is it took several years with the AIDS virus for the scientific community to get interested. And I remember in the late 80s, I can't give you an exact date, but somewhere in the late 80s, around 1990, it became apparent that the scientific community was taking the virus seriously, and money began to be poured into research. And that was an incredibly important, reassuring moment, where now, fortunately, we have labs all over the world, including, I think, SIU is doing something with the virus, the research.
Right. They're doing, one of the things they are doing right now is producing a viral transport medium for testing.
Well, I mean, that is incredibly reassuring to me, and gives me hope that we'll get on top of the virus faster and find a solution faster. But the other difference that really strikes me is, we were able, as with any other disease, when people were dying, we were able to be with those who were dying, family and friends and so on and so forth. What really disturbs me is that too many people, I think, are isolated in hospitals and care facilities and so on and so forth, family can't be with them. Loved ones can't be with them. And I don't think that's good.
Right.
I think we're going to find out that people are getting depressed, maybe sliding into dementia earlier than normal, whatever. And that really, really disturbs me.
Right. And there's, for, people have probably heard this along the way, but, because of the transmittable nature of this virus and not necessarily knowing still how easy or exactly the methods by which it spreads, people who do contract the virus, as soon as they know, they're pretty much isolated from family and friends.
Right.
And they even have limited contact with people once they are in the hospital, and certainly not without any protective gear. So the prospect of suffering from this, and even worse, to get bad enough to be dying from it, it's a very alienating experience as well. People are being read last rites over the phone or over a chat like this as well. I mean, what you've seen the families or seen the people in the families who had suffered with the AIDS virus.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how important was that? That connection obviously was, something that at least made a terrible situation a little bit more palatable.
Oh, I think so. I think it made a huge difference. And, to lose somebody to death when you can't be with them in the latter days, I think that is only going to exaggerate the grieving process for the survivors. And while you've got healthcare workers there, but my God, many of these hospitals, they're absolutely overwhelmed and exhausted. I think something needs to moderate on that front. I think, carefully screened clergy should be able to go. I think you could screen a family member and protect them. But this isolation is not good for certainly the seriously ill and the families who care about them.
Right. What in regards to isolation elsewhere? I mean, just what everyone's kind of somewhat isolated right now. I mean, what does this kind of thing do to, the human psyche when you can't be with someone? A lot of people like to think, I can get by without anyone just fine. Situations like this, you kind of come to find out that's not necessarily true. I mean, even if you don't think you need it, there's a certain degree of human interaction that just kind of reminds us of our own humanity and sometimes and brings it out.
Right. Well, I've got 3 friends, dear friends, who are in care facilities, who are isolated. And I try to stay in touch with them as well as stay in touch with others who I'm, concerned about their isolation. But I hope this doesn't go on too much longer, because we do need human interaction, human touch. So I guess everybody's trying to figure out how to stay in touch with those they care about. But I think we're getting a little weary.
I think, definitely that's starting to show in some of the protests that are happening across the country of people who want to get back to, life as they know it. But, and that's a good point to bring up. After, once you know something is out there, you can't necessarily put that genie back in the bottle. You can't act as though it never happened, much the same way as, the build up to, acknowledging and then researching and finally, finding some fairly effective treatments for the AIDS virus was kind of a slow burn over the course of a couple decades. I don't think that'll necessarily be the case with this, because it just affects so much more of the population and it's much more easily transmittable. It's just more present in everyday life. But I mean, what do you think we should look in your view? I mean, what kinds of things do you think, knowing of how you cope with knowing that AIDS exists, how do we cope with knowing that something like the COVID-19 exists, and there are still others out there, other viruses out there that we may not know about yet?
Well, their day is probably coming, but hopefully not anytime soon. I think, having said what I said, I think the fact that we've we're beginning to move beyond the initial stage of finding out about this and being shocked and terrified. I'm hoping we're beginning to sort of settle down a bit and realize that we need to moderate the restrictions so that there can be greater interaction. But we're obviously feeling our way along. Fear is both with the AIDS. I mean, there were people who feared the AIDS virus and people with AIDS so much that they just isolated themselves. They pulled back. They lived in terror, and we, whatever it takes for us to get over the fear factor or moderate it is absolutely essential,
Right.
so that we can be a little more adult-like and rational, and realize we're not all going to die from this. Most of us are going to survive, to live to tell the tale. You know, the scary thing is, both with AIDS, once we realized what was happening with the virus and so on and so forth, is you don't know, and this is the unfortunate part, you don't know, you know other people are going to die, but you don't know who they are.
Right.
And that keeps us, of course, on guard. And I mean, we have to be somewhat rational about all this, but you know, the AIDS epidemic changed me spiritually and changed a lot of other people spiritually. And I think this is going to happen with the AIDS virus. I mean, with the coronavirus. People are going to look inside and evaluate just what they believe in and what they need to fortify their inner life, their relationships with others, you know, and realize what they can give up that's not that essential. Some really soul searching, deep soul searching, I think, is probably taking place and will continue to take place, which in the long run is what we need to survive. You know, in my own family in Heron in 1903, my great-grandfather died of smallpox. He was the first one to die in Heron. There was an epidemic. And his daughter, youngest daughter, was my great aunt. She told these stories of all that. She lived to be 100. And then my father, who was born in 1901, told the story of the Spanish flu epidemic, in which everybody in his family, and there were about 10 in the household, got sick except him and his mother, and people were dying around them. So I have drawn on those stories when I got into the AIDS epidemic to find strength and courage and hope that, you know, most of us, in fact, will survive.
How did you said it changed you spiritually? I mean, how did that kind of manifest in you? Given that, you know, you're someone who's supposed to, you know, help and kind of interpret and deliver, you know, messages of hope in there. How do you take what you learned and how did it change you and the kind of messages you put out there?
Well, I mean, as a priest, I was trying to preach hope, and when I, you know, ministered to people in the hospital, I tried to help them find hope and inner strength and so on and so forth. But the epidemic came started in my early 40s, and one of the things that I realized that I really like to party a lot, and it humbled me sufficiently that I realized that I had a drinking problem. And I, as a result, joined AA, which was an incredibly spiritual advancement for me, which informs me to this day. You know, I realized in some ways I was taking life too much for granted, and people too much for granted. So that was one of the significant ways. But you know, I think it opened my heart up more to people who were in need or in trouble. And once my focus shifted to what I considered to be a more spiritual place, I couldn't go back.
Right. Um, and I mean, people are, I think people always search for meaning out of things like this. I mean, why does things like this happen? And it just depends on how you view spirituality or how your religion informs your viewpoint on life as to why things like this occur to good people, to people who otherwise may not deserve it. And I mean, how do you kind of explain those things? These are the times, and definitely, I think now that everyone's at home by themselves or within small groups, there's definitely time for a lot more of that thought. So, I mean, how would you guide someone who is having those types of questions or just kind of rationalizing everything they're seeing throughout the day?
Well, of course, why evil happens is an ancient ancient conundrum, which the great minds over the ages, philosophers and the spiritual guides and all that have struggled with, and I don't think there's any definitive answer on why evil happens, like a virus that kills. What I guess what I when somebody's confronted with or says, why me, which often happens when people get sick, you try to steer them away from beating themselves up, from taking it on, taking the blame on too severely, and you try to help them find the inner strength in their own, values. And if you can get them somewhat down that path and have them see that they are human like all other human beings, we're all in this together as human beings. And the key is then to reach out and to help and care for and love other people. And once you get to that place, you begin to see the blessings of helping others. And that sort of builds and becomes its own sort of good infectious operative. I don't know that exactly answers what you asked, but that's the direction I tend to go in.
Right. I mean, there's no right answer really to these things, is there? There's, you kind of have to help. Everyone kind of has to find their own way through this, informed by, obviously outside influences, what they consider to be true and what they believe to be true. So
Right.
you have to navigate these things along your own path and come to your own conclusions. Ultimately, I mean,
Right.
everyone needs some help. Um, how much? I mean, how much of the news are you paying attention to on this?
I
In
read
terms
everything.
of Dan Daily, do you think there is? I mean, with the way it's portrayed or the way things get told, do you think there's enough compassion out there right now in dealing with this, from your point of view?
Well, I think there's a lot of compassion. I really read the newspapers and also check in with friends on Facebook because there's a lot of good, compassionate things going on. I came to tears watching a video yesterday of my great niece, who is a senior in high school in Carterville. And it was her birthday yesterday. And I bet there were 30 cars with kids in them, and parents and kids, who drove in front of their house and wished her happy birthday and threw her presents and blew their horns. And it was incredibly touching to see that. And there's a lot of good things happening everywhere. But one of my concerns is, my fear is that because this is going to go on longer than we want it to go on, that people are going to get tired and they're going to get more and more frustrated and more angry. So in 6 months or something, there could be real conflict. And that, I hope that's not true. But it's hard to sustain focused, caring, sacrificial response for a long period of time. But we'll see. We'll see.
Right. What do you think is going to be kind of the ramifications of the loss that we're going to experience by the end of this, because you said it before, there are more people who are going to pass away because of this disease. You just don't know who. The numbers of people who have already passed away worldwide are catastrophic.
Right.
So, I mean, what is this kind of loss on this kind of scale? What does this tend to do, to the human psyche, or to the masses after experiencing something like this?
Well, one of the things I've discovered in writing my memoir, Ordained by Angels, and I've been going out and doing book signings and speaking about it. And I unfortunately had to cancel 6 book signings in Florida in March and April because of this. People are still grieving from the AIDS epidemic. People are still wanting to talk about loved ones, family members and all that who died 30 years, 40, whatever it's been, 40 years later. There's still a lot of woundedness in and around the AIDS virus. So I think people will be certainly telling stories, writing about this, and grieving for a long, as long as any of us live.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, is there any, I guess there probably is and there isn't a difference to this. I mean, say to someone who kind of died on their own way of either, old age, heart disease, something that was more or less just personal to them that they passed away from, versus someone who was just swept up in this wave of, death that, washed over the entire world.
Right.
And to factor that into this is why some of the people I love are gone now. I mean, is the grieving process different for something like that, as opposed to, something maybe a death of, the individual themselves, or more or less just personal, specific to them?
Well, I don't know that I have an answer to that. One of the things that occurs to me, if I were infected and I went and brought the virus into a group or family or my workplace, and I knew it was me and I survived, I think that would be a heavy, heavy burden to carry. That is one difference that I can pick up.
Yeah, I mean, will there be survivor's guilt out of all this? To see people who have suffered who didn't, or to maybe, especially with those of how easily transmittable it is. There might be someone who was carrying the virus who never knew they carried it to people who did suffer severe consequences because of the virus. Maybe some of them even died. I mean, I don't know that a lot of people, I don't know that the average person is ever necessarily going to know who they transmitted, if they had it, who they transmitted it to, and what the final outcome of that was.
Right.
But at the same point, there's a lot that's still unknown about this particular virus, how it behaves, how it spreads. Right. It's even supposed to be how it obviously is mutating and will continue to do so, and how we'll kind of keep up with it. So I
can tell you that when I get together with friends or whomever who lived intimately through the AIDS epidemic, we'll say to ourselves, why did we survive? Right. If a parent has a child or one of their kids die of the virus, often they say, why wasn't it me? I'd much rather have died instead of have a child die. So that's a pretty common phenomenon when it comes to death. Could I say something about one of the things that's encouraging me?
Yes.
That's similar to the AIDS epidemic is people. It's amazing how much creativity is being triggered by this virus. People are writing poems, they're writing songs, they're doing comedy, and art, serious art, and I suspect that'll continue, and that's incredibly therapeutic for a community. And I encourage anybody who's at any artistic talent whatsoever to use it and share it with others.
I think if there's one way to look at a lot of this positively, it's that in all this, it's some strange way, a lot of people have been given the gift of time. Now, it may not be it may not be financially beneficial. It may not, even be the most stress-free of time they're being given. But I think a lot of people are being given time to slow down, to feel there is no place to go necessarily. There's not this culture that we have of the fear of missing out doesn't necessarily exist right now. That aspect of life has completely been removed from a lot of people. You're not missing out on really anything, because what everyone across the entire world really, or at least across the country right now, is doing.
Right.
Any other closing thoughts or anything? I don't want to keep you too much longer, but in closing in some of this, what are your kind of takeaways from what the situation is right now versus what you went through before?
I don't know that there's anything that we haven't covered.
Right. It's always hard to sum up a conversation like this necessarily, because there are a lot of there's just a lot of stuff that there's only so much you can say, and you don't really know what tomorrow brings on this. And
just on a personal note, I pretty much decided that at this point in my life, I want to move back home to Heron, to be close to my large family. This has really driven that point home to me. I'm essentially retired. I do part-time supply work, but I can do that in Illinois or anywhere. But the value of family and dear ones is, not that I didn't know that before, has really come through strong and loud for me.
Well, good. It'll be it'll be nice to. I think that's always satisfying when you can kind of come full circle in life and kind of end back up where you started.
It would be full circle.
Yeah. Well, and it would be a pretty big circle for you based on where you've been. Course of your career.
You need to rest.
Right. Of course, you are how far from the beach right now?
1 block.
1 block.
And our beach in this small town is not closed.
Well, yeah. So you could easily go take a walk if you want to. So.
Oh yeah.
All right. Well, Reverend, thanks for taking time with us today. Appreciate your insights on this and what you can share. I think we are trying to tap the knowledge in many areas of a lot of our alumni over at SIU. So I appreciate you contributing some of yours to the conversation.
Yeah.
So I will leave it at that, and I hope you have a good day and take care.
All right. Hope to see you down there sometime soon.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.